I stood at the edge of the rooftop, the Atlanta skyline sprawling beneath me like a map of ambition I wasn't sure I could read. The air was thick with the heat of late spring, the kind that clings to your skin and makes every breath feel like a negotiation. My high school diploma was still crisp in my back pocket, the ink barely dry from yesterday's graduation ceremony, but it already felt like a relic, useless against the weight of what came next. Below, the city hummed with purpose, lights flickering in office towers, cars threading through arteries of asphalt, all of it pulsing with a rhythm I didn't yet belong to. Up here, though, it was just me and the wind and the gnawing uncertainty that had kept me awake all night. The door behind me creaked open, and I turned to see Ellen Harper step out, her heels clicking against the concrete with the confidence of someone who'd already conquered her corner of the world. She was my English teacher senior year, Mrs. Harper to the rest of the class, but up here, with the city as our witness, she was just Ellen. Her graying hair caught the fading sunlight, and her eyes, sharp as ever, scanned me like she could see straight through the bravado I'd been trying to stitch together. "Thought I'd find you here," she said, her voice low but steady, cutting through the breeze. "You got that look, like you're about to jump or run, or both." I forced a grin, leaning back against the rusted railing. Maybe I'm just taking in the view before the world chews me up. She didn't laugh, but her lips twitched, a half-smile that told me she'd heard worse excuses. She stepped closer, her navy blazer shifting as she folded her arms. "Your parents still giving you hell about college?" The question landed like a punch I'd been dodging all day. I glanced down at my boots, scuffed from months of odd jobs, and felt the defiance flare up again. They think I'm throwing my life away because I'm not packing for Athens tomorrow. Dad says Horizon Industries is a dead end for someone like me, no degree, no future. Mom just cries and prays like I'm already lost. Ellen tilted her head, studying me. "And what do you think?" I hesitated, the words tangling in my throat. What did I think? That I was terrified, mostly. That rejecting the University of Georgia felt like cutting a lifeline I might never get back. But there was something else, too. A hunger I couldn't name, a restless itch that college brochures and dorm room promises couldn't scratch. Horizon wasn't glamorous, just a sprawling factory on the edge of town cranking out steel beams and paychecks, but it was real. Tangible. Mine, if I could claim it. "I think I'm done letting other people draw the map," I said, finally meeting her gaze. "I start at Horizon Monday. $8 an hour, night shift. It's not a scholarship, but it's something." She nodded, slow and deliberate, like she was weighing my soul on some invisible scale. "It's a start, Jake. Not a sentence. You're not the first to skip the ivory tower, and you won't be the last. But you've got to know what you're walking into. Those places eat ambition if you let them." Her words hung there, heavy with a warning I didn't fully grasp yet. I shifted, the railing creaking under my weight, and glanced out at the skyline again. The tallest buildings loomed like monuments to men who'd never punched a clock, their glass facades reflecting a city that didn't care about kids like me. But down there, somewhere beyond the haze, was Horizon, gritty, loud, and unapologetic. It wasn't power, not yet, but it was a foothold. A chance to prove I could stand on my own. "Why'd you come up here?" I asked, turning back to her. "You didn't have to track me down." Ellen unfolded her arms, resting a hand on the railing beside me. "Because I've seen too many kids like you, bright, stubborn, full of fire, get swallowed by this city before they figure out who they are. You're not my student anymore, Jake, but I'm not done betting on you." Her faith hit me harder than my parents' disappointment. I swallowed, the lump in my throat tightening, and for a moment, I could almost see it, me years from now, standing somewhere higher than this rooftop, looking back at this night as the pivot point. But then the wind picked up, sharp and cold, and the uncertainty crashed back in. Horizon was a gamble, and I was betting everything on a hand I hadn't even seen yet. "You think I can make it?" My voice came out quieter than I meant, almost lost in the city's hum. Ellen's eyes softened, but her tone stayed firm. "I think you've got a shot, if you don't let pride or fear call the plays. Start at Horizon. Bust your ass. But don't stop there. This city's a machine, Jake. Learn how it works, or it'll grind you down." I nodded, the weight of her words settling into my bones. The skyline blurred as dusk crept in, the lights sharpening against the dark. Monday loomed like a shadow I couldn't outrun, and beneath the defiance, a flicker of hope sparked, small, fragile, but alive. Ellen was right, this wasn't a sentence. It was a beginning. Whether it'd break me or build me, I'd find out soon enough. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the guidance counselor's office, casting a sterile glow over the chipped wooden desk and the stacks of college brochures that seemed to mock me from every corner. It was Friday afternoon, 2 days before graduation, and the air smelled of stale coffee and desperation, mine mostly. I sat slouched in a hard plastic chair, my hands stuffed into the pockets of my jeans, staring at the career survey form Ms. Pritchard had shoved across the desk at me 10 minutes ago. Her pen tapped rhythmically against her clipboard, each click tightening the knot in my chest. "So, Jake," she said, her voice clipped and overly bright, like she was auditioning for a pep rally. "Have you given any more thought to your future? UGA's deadline for late acceptance is next week." I could make a call. No thanks. I cut in, my tone sharper than I meant it to be. I pulled my hands out of my pockets and leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "I'm not going." Her pen stopped mid-tap, and her eyebrows shot up, crinkling the foundation caked around her eyes. "Not going. Jake, you've got the grades. A little financial aid, a part-time job. You could make it work. Your parents. My parents don't get a vote," I said, the defiance bubbling up hot and fast. I grabbed the survey form, the edges curling slightly from the humidity, and scanned the boxes. Asterisk college, / university. Trade school. Military. Other. Asterisk. My pencil hovered over the last one, the graphite trembling in my grip. "I'm done with people telling me what I'm supposed to do." Ms. Pritchard sighed, a long, dramatic exhale that made me want to bolt for the door. "This isn't about them, Jake. It's about you. Horizon Industries? That's a factory job. Night shifts, dirty hands, no upward mobility without a degree. You're too smart for that." I clenched my jaw, the words stinging more than I'd admit. Smart. That's what everyone kept saying, like it was a ticket I was supposed to cash in for a dorm room and a lecture hall. But all I could see was my dad's face last night, red and twisted as he yelled about wasting potential, and my mom's quiet sobs from the kitchen, her rosary beads clicking like a countdown to my failure. Smart didn't feel like a gift, it felt like a chain. The pencil scratched across the paper as I checked other and scrawled Horizon Industries in the blank space below. My handwriting was messy, defiant, the letters bleeding into each other, like a dare. I slid the form back across the desk, the sound of it scraping against the wood louder than it should have been in the cramped room. Ms. Pritchard stared at it, her lips pursing into a thin line. "You're sure about this?" "Yeah," I said, meeting her gaze. My pulse hammered in my ears, a mix of fear and something fiercer, pride, maybe, or just stubbornness. "I start Monday." She shook her head, muttering something under her breath about throwing away opportunities, but I was already halfway out of my seat, the chair screeching against the linoleum. The office felt smaller now, the walls pressing in with every brochure I passed, bright smiles and ivy-covered buildings I'd never see. I didn't look back as I pushed through the door into the hallway, the murmur of the school fading behind me. The corridor was mostly empty, lockers lining the walls like silent sentinels, their chipped paint a testament to years of kids like me passing through. My boots echoed on the tile, each step heavier than the last, and that's when I saw her, Ellen Harper, leaning against the trophy case near the English wing, a stack of graded essays tucked under her arm. She didn't look surprised to see me, just tilted her head slightly, her gray eyes locking onto mine with that unnerving calm she always carried. "Rough day?" she asked, her voice cutting through the haze in my head. I stopped, shoving my hands back into my pockets. "You could say that. Just told Pritchard I'm not doing the college thing." She acted like I signed up for a firing squad. Ellen's lips quirked into that half-smile of hers, the one that made you feel seen and judged all at once. "And what did you sign up for instead?" "Horizon," I said, lifting my chin a little, daring her to echo Pritchard's disappointment. "Night shift, $8 an hour." She didn't flinch, didn't sigh, didn't launch into a lecture. Instead, she shifted the essays to her other arm and stepped closer, her heels clicking softly. "That's a choice, Jake. Not a death sentence. But you know it's not going to be easy, right?" I shrugged, the weight of the day pressing down on my shoulders. "Nothing worth doing is, I guess. Dad thinks I'm screwing myself. Mom's praying for my soul. I can't sit in a classroom for 4 more years, Ellen. I need something real." Her gaze softened, but there was a steel beneath it, a quiet strength I'd always admired. Real's a good place to start. Horizon's a beast, though. Grinds people up if they don't push back. You've got fire in you, Jake. Don't let it burn out there. I swallowed, the lump in my throat tightening again. Fire. That's what it felt like something was blazing inside me, wild and reckless, and I didn't know if it'd light my way or torch everything I touched. You think I'm crazy for this? No, she said simply, and the word landed like a lifeline. I think you're brave. Crazy's playing it safe when you know it'll kill you inside. You're choosing a fight, your fight. Just make sure you're ready for it. The bell rang, a shrill echo bouncing off the walls, and a flood of students spilled into the hallway, their laughter and chatter swallowing the silence. Ellen stepped back, giving me a nod that felt like permission, like belief. Monday's coming fast, she said. Get some rest. Yeah, I muttered, watching her turn toward her classroom. The crowd swirled around me, but I stood there a moment longer, the survey form's weight still ghosting my fingers. I'd made my choice, drawn my line. Horizon was waiting, dirty, loud, and unforgiving, and with it, a turning point I could feel in my gut, sharp and electric. Ellen's words echoed in my head. Your fight. For the first time all day, the uncertainty didn't feel like drowning. It felt like a spark. The break room at Horizon Industries smelled like burned coffee and motor oil, a gritty perfume that clung to everything. The chipped formica tables, the vending machine humming in the corner, even the faded safety posters curling at the edges on the walls. 10 years had passed since that night on the rooftop with Ellen, and I'd carved out a place here, a small island of respect amid the clang of steel and the hiss of machinery. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow over the cluster of guys sprawled across the room, second-shift welders and line workers, their coveralls smeared with grease, swapping stories over lukewarm sodas. I leaned against the counter, a styrofoam cup cooling in my hand, the ache in my shoulders a familiar companion after a decade of hauling beams and dodging forklifts. Bennett, you hear about the new line quotas. Tommy Ruiz called from the table nearest the door, his voice cutting through the low murmur of exhaustion. He was a wiry guy, mid-30s like me, with a quick grin and a temper to match. They're jacking him up again. Grayson's orders. I nodded, taking a sip of the bitter coffee, the name Grayson tightening my jaw like a reflex. Dr. Richard Grayson, Horizon's new director, fresh from some Ivy League boardroom, with a PhD in management and a knack for making you feel like dirt under his polished loafers. He'd been here 3 months and already the plant felt like a pressure cooker, every shift stretched thin by his efficiency mandates. Yeah, I heard, I said, keeping my tone even. Means more overtime. More pay, if we don't keel over first. The guys chuckled, a tired, jagged sound, but there was an edge to it, resentment simmering just below the surface. I got it. 10 years in, I'd earned their trust, not with a degree or a title, but with sweat and stubbornness. Started on the night shift at 18, busting my ass through the grunt work, sweeping floors, stacking crates, until I climbed to lead operator on the second shift. No corner office, no handshake from the suits upstairs, but down here, in the belly of the beast, I had something. Respect. A name. Jake Bennett wasn't just another cog. Tommy leaned back in his chair, cracking his knuckles. You see the way Grayson strutted through yesterday? Like he owns us. Guy's never touched a welder, but he's got opinions on how fast we should bleed. He's a numbers man, I said, setting the cup down, the warmth fading from my fingers. Doesn't care about the hands that make M. My voice stayed steady, but inside, the old defiance flared hotter now, tempered by years of watching guys like Tommy get ground down while the Graysons of the world cashed their bonuses. Tell you what, though, chimed in Carl, a grizzled vet with a salt and pepper beard, wiping his hands on a rag. Bennett here's been killing it on the line. Foreman was bragging about your output last week, Jake. Said you're running circles around the newbies. I shrugged, a flicker of pride warming my chest despite the fatigue tugging at me. Just doing my job. Somebody's got to keep this place from falling apart. Nah, man, Tommy said, pointing a callous finger at me. You're a damn machine. Grayson might not see it, but we do. You ever think about pushing for supervisor? You've got the chops. The question caught me off guard, and for a second, the room felt smaller, the air thicker. Supervisor. More responsibility, sure, but also a step closer to the offices upstairs, closer to the power I'd spent years telling myself I didn't need. I'd built my life down here, in the dirt and noise, proving I didn't need a degree to matter. But Tommy's words stirred something, an ache, a hunger I hadn't let myself name since that rooftop. Ambition, maybe, or just the ghost of Ellen's voice, daring me not to stop. Before I could answer, the door swung open, and the mood shifted like a cold front rolling in. Grayson himself stepped inside, his tailored suit absurdly out of place against the scuffed linoleum and stained walls. His silver hair gleamed under the lights, and his eyes, sharp, predatory, swept the room, landing on me last. The chatter died fast, replaced by the hum of the vending machine and the faint drip of the sink. He carried a clipboard because of course he did, and the click of his pen felt like a gunshot in the silence. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice smooth and clipped, the kind of tone that made you feel like a kid caught sneaking out. "Break's over in 5. I trust you're all ready to meet the new quotas. Efficiency is the priority now." Tommy muttered something under his breath, too low for Grayson to catch, but I felt it, a ripple of defiance mirrored in my own gut. Grayson's gaze lingered on me, and I straightened, meeting it head on. 10 years of busting my ass, and this guy looked at me like I was a line item he could erase. "Bennett, isn't it?" he said, glancing at his clipboard like he didn't already know. "Lead operator. Impressive output, I'll give you that. Surprising, really, for someone without formal credentials." The room went still, the weight of his words hanging like smoke. My hands curled into fists at my sides, the pride from Carl's praise curdling into something darker. Surprising. Like every beam I'd hauled, every shift I'd pulled, was a fluke because I didn't have his precious parchment. The old uncertainty crept in, Ellen's warning about this place eating ambition, but I shoved it down, letting the heat rise instead. "Just means I work harder," I said, my voice low but steady, each word a brick wall I was building right there. "Results speak louder than paper." Grayson's lips twitched, a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Results, yes. But ambition without direction? That's a liability. You do well to remember who's steering this ship." He didn't wait for a reply, just turned on his heel and strode out, the door banging shut behind him. The room exhaled, tension bleeding into muttered curses and the scrape of chairs. Tommy clapped me on the shoulder, his grin tight. "You just stare down the devil, man. Ballsy." I forced a laugh, but my pulse was hammering, Grayson's words clawing at me. Liability. Direction. He'd aimed that jab right at the fault line I'd spent a decade papering over, the kid who'd skipped college, betting on grit instead of a diploma. I'd earned my place here, damn it, but standing in that break room, the walls pressing in with their peeling paint and faded rules, I felt the first crack. Respect wasn't enough anymore. Not when a guy like Grayson could waltz in and reduce it to ash with a smirk. Later, alone by the lockers, the plant's roar a dull pulse through the concrete. I caught my reflection in the dented metal door, older, harder, lines etched around my eyes from too many late nights. I defied the odds, made something of myself without their rules. But Grayson's arrival was a challenge I hadn't seen coming, a reminder that down here, respect was borrowed, not owned. And for the first time in years, I wondered if Ellen's spark had dimmed, if I'd let Horizon grind me down after all. The lobby of Horizon Industries was a cavernous space, all polished concrete and steel beams, a monument to the company's pride that felt more like a cage the longer I stood there. The late afternoon lights slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the floor, and the air hummed with the distant clatter of the plant beyond the double doors. I'd been called up here by Grayson's assistant, a curt email, no explanation, just director's office for PM sharp. My boots echoed on the tile as I crossed the room, the sound swallowed by the murmur of suits shuffling papers behind the reception desk. The weight of 10 years pressed down on me, 10 years of sweat and steel, of proving I belonged, and now this. A summons. My gut churned, a mix of dread and defiance I couldn't shake. The receptionist barely glanced up from her screen. "Bennett, he's waiting." Her voice was flat, mechanical, like she'd already written me off. I nodded, adjusting the collar of my work shirt, the fabric stiff with dried sweat from a morning shift. The hallway to Grayson's office loomed ahead, lined with framed photos of Horizon's glory days, black and white shots of men in hard hats, grinning beside cranes and girders. My face wasn't up there, but my hands had built this place, beam by beam. That had to count for something, didn't it? The door to his office was ajar, and I pushed it open without knocking, the hinges creaking in the silence. Grayson sat behind a mahogany desk that looked like it cost more than my truck, his silver hair catching the light from a sleek desk lamp. He didn't look up from a folder in his hands, my file, I realized, the edges worn from years of updates, but the smirk tugging at his lips told me he knew I was there. The room smelled of leather and expensive cologne, a far cry from the oil-soaked air of the plant floor. A wall of windows stretched behind him, framing the Atlanta skyline like a trophy, and I felt the gap between us widen with every second I stood there. "Bennett," he said finally, his voice smooth as glass, eyes still on the papers. "Close the door." I did, the click sounding too loud, too final. My pulse kicked up, but I kept my face steady, stepping forward to stand across from him. The chair in front of his desk stayed empty. I wasn't about to sit like some kid in the principal's office. "You wanted to see me." He flipped a page, slow and deliberate, letting the silence stretch until it clawed at me. Then he looked up, his gaze cold, appraising, like I was a number that didn't add up. 10 years, he said, tapping the folder. "Impressive tenure for someone with your background. No degree, no formal training. Just grit, hmm?" The jab landed, sharp and familiar, but I held my ground. Grit's gotten me this far. Output's up on my line. Foreman's numbers don't lie. "Numbers," he echoed, leaning back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Yes, you've been useful. But usefulness has limits, Jake. Horizon's moving forward, new systems, new priorities. I need people who can think, not just lift." My fists tightened at my sides, the heat rising in my chest. 10 years of busting my ass, earning respect from the guys who mattered, and here he was, slicing it all away with a single sentence. "I think plenty," I said, my voice low, controlled. "I think about keeping your quotas met while you sit up here moving paper." His smirk widened, and he stood, circling the desk with the slow grace of a predator. He was taller than me, broader in the shoulders, his suit tailored to perfection, while my shirt hung loose, stained with the day's work. "Bold," he said, stopping just close enough to make me feel the weight of his presence. "But boldness isn't a substitute for credentials. You bumped into me yesterday, Jake, literally. Spilled coffee on my shoes. Careless. Sloppy. A liability." The memory flashed, rushing through the plant with a stack of reports, clipping his shoulder by accident, the scalding coffee splashing across his loafers. I'd muttered an apology, but his glare had stayed with me, a promise of something worse. Now here it was. "It was a mistake," I said, meeting his eyes. "Won't happen again." "Oh, I know it won't." He turned, picking up a single sheet from the desk, a pink slip, the Horizon logo stamped at the top. "You're done here, Bennett. Effective immediately." The words hit like a punch to the gut, stealing the air from my lungs. Fired. After a decade of proving myself, of building something real, he was cutting me loose over a spilled cup of coffee. My vision blurred at the edges, rage and humiliation warring inside me, but before I could speak, the door swung open behind me. "Richard, what the hell is this?" The voice was sharp, female, and unfamiliar, slicing through the tension like a blade. I turned to see a woman stride in mid-30s, dark hair pulled back tight, her navy blazer crisp against the chaos of the moment. Megan Harper, I realized, recognition clicking into place. Ellen's niece. She'd been a junior exec at Horizon for a year, a rare suit who actually talked to the floor guys, but I'd never seen her like this. Eyes blazing, a stack of files clutched in her arms. Grayson's smirk faltered, just for a second. "Megan, this doesn't concern you." "Like hell it doesn't," she snapped, dropping the files onto his desk with a thud. "Jake's one of the best operators we've got. You're firing him over a personal grudge? That's not efficiency, that's petty." My head spun, caught between the wreckage of Grayson's words and the lifeline Megan was throwing. She knew me, knew my work, and she was standing there, fighting for me in a way I hadn't expected. Gratitude flickered, fragile but real, beneath the storm in my chest. Grayson's jaw tightened, his composure cracking. "This is my call, Harper. He's a relic, no education, no vision. Horizon's better off without him." Megan stepped closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "You're wrong, and I'm not letting you tank morale over your ego. Jake, you're with me. Harper Solutions needs talent, and I'm not watching it walk out the door." I blinked, the shift too sudden to process fully. Harper Solutions, Ellen's company, I remember now, a smaller outfit on the edge of the city, scrappy and ambitious. Megan was offering me a way out, a chance to escape Grayson's blade, but the humiliation still burned, raw and jagged. 10 years, reduced to nothing in front of her, in front of him. My pride screamed to fight, to claw back what I'd lost, but the weight of Grayson's smirk, the certainty he'd already won, held me still. "Jake." Megan's voice softened, pulling me back. Her eyes met mine, steady, insistent. "You don't belong here anymore. Come with me." Grayson chuckled, a low, bitter sound. "Run along, Bennett. Seems you found a savior." Don't trip on your way out. The taunt snapped something inside me, and I took a step toward him, my fists trembling, but Megan's hand brushed my arm. Light, firm, a warning. He's not worth it, she murmured, barely audible. I exhaled, the rage coiling tight but leashed, and turned to face her. Okay, I said, the word rough, scraped from somewhere deep. I'm in. She nodded, a flicker of relief crossing her face, and gestured toward the door. I followed, the pink slip still clutched in Grayson's hand behind me, the lobby stretching out ahead like a battlefield I'd just lost. The air felt heavier now, thick with the stench of defeat, but beneath it, something else stirred. Anger, yes, but also a spark of something sharper. Determination. Grayson thought he'd broken me, but Megan's offer was a crack in the wall, a glimpse of a fight I hadn't seen coming. As we crossed the lobby, the receptionist's eyes flicked up, then away, and the distant roar of the plant faded behind the glass. 10 years of horizon slipped through my fingers, but the weight of Megan's faith and the shadow of Ellen's legacy pressed against my spine. This wasn't the end. It was a turning point, jagged and raw, and I'd be damned if I let bury me. The elevator doors slid shut behind us with a soft hiss, sealing Megan and me in a steel box that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old cigarette smoke. The hum of the motor filled the silence as we descended from Horizon's gleaming lobby to the parking garage below. My boots scuffed against the worn floor, the sound sharp against the muffled thud of my pulse in my ears. The pink slip wasn't in my hand. Grayson had kept it, a trophy of his victory, but its weight hung on me, heavier than the toolbox I'd slung over my shoulder. 10 years of my life, packed into a dented metal case and a frayed duffel bag, all because of a spilled coffee and a man who saw me as less than the dirt on his shoes. Megan stood beside me, her arms crossed, the stack of files she'd slammed on Grayson's desk now tucked neatly under one elbow. Her jaw was set, her dark eyes fixed on the glowing numbers ticking down, 5, 4, 3, like she was counting the seconds until we could breathe again. The navy blazer hugged her frame, crisp and professional, but there was a tension in her shoulders, a coiled energy that mirrored the storm churning inside me. She'd just gone toe-to-toe with Grayson, a man who could have crushed her career with a phone call, and she'd done it for me. I didn't know what to make of that yet. Gratitude tangled with humiliation, relief warring with the bitter sting of being saved. The elevator jolted to a stop, and the doors parted to reveal the garage, a dim, sprawling cave of concrete pillars and flickering fluorescent tubes. The air was cooler here, thick with the tang of gasoline and rust, and our footsteps echoed as we stepped out. My truck was parked in the far corner, a battered F-150 that had carried me through a decade of early mornings and late nights. But Megan turned left toward a sleek black sedan, her heels clicking with purpose against the oil-stained floor. "Over here," she said, her voice cutting through the haze in my head. "You're not driving like this." I stopped, the toolbox banging against my thigh. "Like what?" She glanced back, her eyes meeting mine for the first time since we'd left Grayson's office. There was no pity there, thank God, just a steady, unyielding calm that pinned me in place. Like you're one wrong turn from putting your fist through something. Or someone. Get in. Her tone left no room for argument, and honestly, I didn't have the fight in me to push back. Not now. I followed her to the sedan, tossing my gear into the back seat as she slid behind the wheel. The interior smelled of leather and faint lavender, a stark contrast to the grease-soaked cab of my truck. I sank into the passenger seat, the cushion too soft, too clean, and stared out the tinted window as she pulled out of the garage. The city blurred past, towers of glass and steel giving way to squat warehouses and chain-link fences, while the ache in my chest tightened, a knot of rage and loss I couldn't untangle. "Where are we going?" I asked finally, my voice rough, scraped raw by the day. "Harper Solutions," she said, her hands steady on the wheel. "You're starting tonight. No point in wasting time." I turned to her, the words sinking in slow and heavy. "Tonight. Megan, I just got canned. I haven't even." I gestured vaguely at the toolbox behind us, at the mess of my life spilling out of it. "I need to pack up my desk, figure out. There's nothing to figure out at Horizon," she cut in, her voice sharp but not unkind. "Grayson's made his move. You're out. But I'm not letting him bury you. You're too good for that." Her certainty hit me like a lifeline, thin but strong, and I clung to it despite the chaos in my head. Too good. She'd said it like a fact, not a favor, and for a moment, I could almost believe her. But the memory of Grayson's smirk, of his smooth, venomous, "You're done, Bennett," clawed at me, dragging me back to that office, to the polished desk and the skyline he'd claimed as his kingdom. 10 years of proving myself, of building a name from nothing, and he'd torn it down in 5 minutes. My fists clenched in my lap, nails digging into my palms until the pain sharpened my focus. Why me? The question slipped out before I could stop it, low and jagged. You didn't have to stick your neck out back there. You don't even know me, not really. Megan's eyes flicked to me, then back to the road. A beat passed, the hum of the engine filling the gap. "I know enough," she said at last. "I've seen your work, Jake. The way you run that line, the way the crew respects you, it's not just sweat. It's instinct. Grayson's too blind to see it, but I'm not. And neither is Ellen." Ellen. The name jolted me, a spark igniting in the fog of my thoughts. Ellen's behind this. Megan's lips curved, a faint, knowing smile. "She's the one who told me to keep an eye on you years ago. Said you had fire, stubborn as hell, but worth betting on. When I saw Grayson's play today, I knew she'd want you with us." The pieces clicked together, slow and staggering. Ellen Harper, my old teacher, the woman who'd stood with me on that rooftop a decade ago, hadn't just been a voice in my past. She'd been watching, waiting, maybe even steering me toward this moment. The thought stirred something deep, a mix of awe and unease. I'd built my life on defiance, on rejecting the paths others laid out for me, but now here I was, caught in a web I hadn't even seen. Ellen's faith, Megan's gamble, a chance I hadn't earned. I leaned back, the leather creaking under me, and scrubbed a hand over my face. "So what's the catch? Harper Solutions isn't Horizon. Smaller outfit, less muscle. What do you need me for?" Megan slowed as we approached a stoplight, the red glow painting her face in sharp relief. "We're not smaller by choice," she said, her voice dipping into something harder, something personal. "Horizon's been squeezing us out, poaching contracts, undercutting bids. Grayson's not just a bastard to his own people, he's a predator. Ellen's been fighting him for years, but we're at a tipping point. We need someone who knows how he thinks, how his operation ticks. Someone who's been inside." The light turned green, and she pressed the gas, the sedan surging forward. My mind raced to keep up, the implications sinking in like stones. This wasn't just a job offer, it was a war. Ellen and Megan weren't saving me out of charity, they were recruiting me. A soldier, maybe, or a weapon. The idea should have scared me, but instead, it lit a fire in my gut, a flicker of purpose cutting through the wreckage of the day. Grayson had humiliated me, stripped me bare, but now I had a chance to hit back, not with fists, but with something sharper. Knowledge, grit, the very things he'd mocked. "You're asking me to turn on them," I said, testing the weight of it. 10 years at Horizon, those guys on the line, they're my family. You want me to use that against them? "No," she said quickly, her tone firm. "Not against them, against him. Grayson's the cancer, not the crew. You know that better than anyone. Help us take him down, Jake. Not for me, not even for Ellen. For you." Her words hung there, heavy and electric, and I felt the shift inside me, a crack widening, letting something new flood in. Revenge. Not the wild, reckless kind I'd imagined in that office, lunging across Grayson's desk to wipe that smirk off his face, but something colder, smarter. A reckoning. My hands unclenched, the tension easing just enough to breathe, and I stared out at the city sliding past, warehouses giving way to a modest industrial park, Harper Solutions' low-brick building coming into view. The parking lot was half empty, the late afternoon sun glinting off a handful of cars, and the sign out front, Harper Solutions, engineering tomorrow. It wasn't Horizon's towering arrogance, but there was a quiet strength to it, a scrappy defiance I recognized. Megan pulled into a spot near the entrance, cutting the engine, and the silence settled over us like a blanket. I turned to her, the question burning in my throat. "What's Ellen's endgame? She's not just playing defense, is she?" Megan's smile returned, sharper this time, a glint of steel in her eyes. "Ellen doesn't play defense. She's been building this company to outlast men like Grayson, to prove you don't need their rules to win. But she's not naive. She knows we can't just survive him, we have to bury him. That's where you come in." The weight of it settled over me, heavy but not crushing. Ellen's fire, Megan's resolve, they saw something in me I'd almost forgotten, a spark I'd let Horizon dim but never extinguish. Grayson thought he'd ended me, cast me out like trash, but he'd miscalculated. I wasn't done, not by a long shot. The humiliation still burned, a raw edge I couldn't ignore, but beneath it, something else was growing. A hunger, a need to prove him wrong, to turn his victory into ash. Megan opened her door, the cool air rushing in, and nodded toward the building. Come on, let's get you settled. Grayson's not the only one who can play hardball. I grabbed my toolbox and stepped out, the concrete solid under my boots, the horizon stretching out beyond the lot. A new battlefield, smaller but fiercer. The anger was still there, coiled tight, but now it had a direction, a purpose. Grayson had wanted to break me, but he'd just handed me the match. I'd burn his world down if I had to, one spark at a time. The glass doors of Harper Solutions slid open with a whisper, and I stepped into the lobby, the cool air hitting me like a slap after the muggy heat of the parking lot. My toolbox banged against my leg, a dull thud echoing in the quiet space, and I shifted it higher, gripping the handle tight to steady myself. The room was modest, polished concrete floors, a few mismatched chairs, a reception desk cluttered with papers, but it carried a raw, stubborn energy, like a fighter who'd taken too many punches and still refused to fall. Overhead, fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow that sharpened the edges of everything. The scuffed walls, the faded company logo etched into a steel plate behind the desk, my own shadow stretching long and jagged across the floor. Megan walked ahead, her heels clicking with purpose, but I slowed, my eyes catching on a framed photo near the entrance, a younger Ellen Harper standing beside a group of engineers in hard hats, a blueprint spread out on a table. She looked fierce even then, her graying hair pulled back tight, her gaze locked on something beyond the camera. 10 years ago, she'd stood with me on that rooftop, betting on a kid with nothing but defiance and a diploma. Now here I was walking into her world, a lifeline thrown just as Grayson's knife sank deep. The weight of it pressed against my ribs, gratitude, yes, but tangled with something darker, a gnawing shame that I'd needed saving it all. You coming? Megan's voice snapped me back, and I glanced up to see her holding the inner door open, her expression unreadable but urgent. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, and followed her into a narrow hallway lined with offices. The air here was thicker, laced with the faint hum of machinery and the murmur of voices behind closed doors. My boots felt too loud, too heavy, each step a reminder of the grease-stained life I'd just lost. 10 years at Horizon, stripped away in a heartbeat. Grayson's smirk still burned into my skull. We stopped at a corner office, the door cracked open, a sliver of warm light spilling into the hall. Megan knocked once, sharp and deliberate, then pushed it wide. Ellen, he's here. I stepped in behind her, and the room hit me like a memory I hadn't earned. It wasn't Horizon's polished arrogance, no mahogany desks or skyline views here, but a cluttered, lived-in space that smelled of coffee and old paper. Shelves sagged under the weight of binders and rolled blueprints, a battered couch sat in one corner, and a broad window overlooked the industrial park, the late afternoon sun painting the warehouses gold. Ellen Harper stood behind a desk strewn with files, her navy blazer swapped for a worn cardigan, her gray hair looser now, framing a face that hadn't softened with time. Her eyes met mine, sharp and steady, and for a moment I was 18 again, standing on that rooftop with the city at my feet. Jake Bennett, she said, her voice low and warm, cutting through the chaos in my head. Been a while. I set the toolbox down, the clang louder than I meant it to be, and forced my hands into my pockets to keep them still. Yeah, didn't exactly plan on showing up like this. Her lips twitched, that half smile I remembered, and she stepped around the desk, closing the distance between us. Up close, the lines around her eyes were deeper, etched by years I hadn't witnessed, but the steel in her gaze was unchanged. Nobody plans the fall, she said. It's what you do after that matters. Megan filled me in. Grayson's a bastard, but that's not news. Sit. She gestured to a chair across from her desk, and I hesitated, the instinct to stay on my feet warring with the exhaustion seeping into my bones. Megan lingered by the door, arms crossed, watching us both like a referee waiting for the bell. I sank into the chair, the worn leather creaking under me, and Ellen perched on the edge of her desk, her hands folded in her lap. The casualness of it threw me, like we were picking up a conversation from yesterday, not a decade later with my life in pieces. I heard you gave Horizon 10 good years, she said, her tone even but probing. Climbed your way up, earned your stripes. Then Grayson waltzes in and kicks you out over spilled coffee. That about right. The summary stung, raw and too simple, and I felt the heat rise in my chest again. Anger, humiliation, the jagged edge of loss. Pretty much, I said, my voice tighter than I wanted. 10 years of busting my ass, and he calls me a liability. No degree, no vision, his words. Fired me in front of his desk like I was nothing. Ellen's jaw tightened, a flicker of something fierce crossing her face, but she didn't interrupt. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, the words spilling out now, sharp and unfiltered. I built something there, Ellen. Respect, a name, guys on a line, they trusted me. And he just shredded it, like it was a game to him. It was, she said, her voice cutting through mine like a blade. Men like Grayson don't see people, they see pawns. You were a threat, Jake, not a liability. Too good at what you do, too stubborn to bow. He didn't fire you because you bumped into him. He fired you because he couldn't control you. Her words landed hard, a jolt that straightened my spine. A threat. Not a relic, not a failure, a threat. The idea shifted something inside me, twisting the shame into something hotter, something I could use. But before I could grab hold of it, Megan stepped forward, her voice crisp and urgent. He's not wrong to feel cornered, Ellen, she said, dropping her files onto a side table with a thud. Grayson's tightening the screws on us too. That new contract with Apex Metals? Horizon swooped in last night, undercut us by 10%. We're bleeding clients, and he knows it. Firing Jake was just the appetizer. He's coming for us next. Ellen's eyes narrowed, her gaze flicking between us, and the room seemed to shrink, the air growing heavy with the weight of what she didn't say. I felt it then, the stakes climbing higher, the shadow of Grayson stretching beyond Horizon's walls to choke this place too. My firing wasn't just personal, it was a move in a bigger game, one I'd stumbled into blind. The realization hit like a punch, and my hands curled into fists, the toolbox at my feet a silent witness to the wreckage he'd left behind. So what's the play? I asked, my voice rough but steady now. Megan says you need me, someone who knows Horizon, knows Grayson. But I'm fresh off a pink slip, Ellen. What the hell can I do that you can't? Ellen leaned back, crossing her arms, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she stood, pacing to the window, her silhouette sharp against the fading light. You're not here to lick wounds, Jake. You're here because you've got something we don't. 10 years inside that machine. You know how Grayson thinks, how his operation runs, where the cracks are. We're not just fighting to survive him anymore. We're going to dismantle him. The words hung there, bold and electric, and my pulse kicked up, a mix of dread and hunger stirring in my gut. Dismantle him. Not just endure, not just outlast, destroy. The idea was intoxicating, a lifeline laced with venom, and I could feel it sinking into me, feeding the anger I'd carried out of that lobby. But beneath it, a colder thread tightened, doubt, sharp and insistent. 10 years at Horizon had been my life, my family, and now I was being asked to turn it against them. Not just Grayson, but the whole damn system I'd bled for. I stood, the chair scraping back, and faced her. You're asking me to betray them. The guys on the line, Tommy Carl, they're not Grayson. They're good people, caught in the same grinder I was. I help you, and they're the ones who get hurt. Ellen turned, her eyes locking onto mine, unflinching. No, Jake. Grayson's the one hurting them, squeezing quotas, cutting corners, tossing out anyone who doesn't fit his blueprint. You think he stops at you? He'll grind them down too, one by one, until there's nothing left but his profit margins. You're not betraying them. You're fighting for them, even if they don't see it yet. Her logic was a knife, slicing through the fog in my head, but it didn't dull the ache, the moral tangle twisting tighter with every word. Revenge felt clean, pure, a fire I could stoke until Grayson burned. But this was murkier, a gray haze where justice and betrayal blurred into each other. I'd spent a decade proving I could stand tall without a degree, without their rules, and now I was staring down a choice that could either redeem that fight or bury it for good. Megan broke the silence, her voice softer now, but no less firm. We're running out of time, Jake. Grayson's not slowing down. He's got the Apex deal, and he's sniffing around our next bid. If we don't hit back soon, Harper Solutions is done. You're not just a hire here. You're the edge we need. The edge. The word echoed, sharp and seductive, and I felt the shift inside me, a crack widening, letting the anger flood back in hotter now, tempered by something new. Purpose. Grayson had humiliated me, stripped me bare, but he'd misjudged me. I wasn't broken, not yet. And if Ellen and Megan were right, I wasn't powerless either. The guys on the line flashed through my mind. Tommy's grin, Carl's steady hands, and the guilt stabbed deep, but Ellen's voice drowned out. You're fighting for them. I exhaled, the sound rough in the quiet room, and met Ellen's gaze. Okay, I'm in, but I need to know the plan. What exactly are we doing to him? Ellen's half-smile returned, a glint of steel in her eyes. Good. First, you tell us everything. Every weak spot in Horizon's armor, every move Grayson's made that we can turn against him. Then we hit him where it hurts. His contracts, his reputation, his bottom line. He thinks he's untouchable up there, in his tower. We're going to prove him wrong. The air shifted, charged now with a tension that felt less like despair and more like a coiled spring. My mind raced, pulling up a decade's worth of memories, overheard conversations in the break room, Grayson's smug directives, the plant's bottlenecks he'd ignored in his push for numbers. I knew Horizon's guts better than he ever would, and that knowledge was a weapon, heavy but mine to wield. Megan nodded, stepping closer, her files forgotten on the table. We start tonight. I'll pull the team, engineers, analysts, whoever's still here. You give us the raw data, Jake, and we'll turn it into a plan. Grayson won't know what hit him. I glanced between them, Ellen's quiet fire, Megan's relentless drive, and felt the ground steady beneath me, just for a moment. The humiliation still burned, a raw wound I couldn't ignore, but it was fuel now, not just pain. Grayson had wanted me gone, erased, but he'd handed me the match instead. I'd burn his empire down if I had to, one spark, one crack at a time. Ellen moved back to her desk, pulling a legal pad from the chaos and scribbling something fast. Get settled, Jake. You've got a desk down the hall. Nothing fancy, but it's yours. We're in this together now. I grabbed my toolbox, the weight familiar, grounding, and nodded. Let's do it. As I followed Megan out, the office door swinging shut behind us, the pressure tightened, Grayson's shadow looming larger, the stakes climbing higher. The crisis wasn't over, it was just beginning. But for the first time since that pink slip hit my hands, I wasn't drowning. I was fighting. The air in Ellen's office felt thicker now, charged with the weight of what we'd just set in motion. I stood by the window, my toolbox still clutched in one hand, the cool glass pressing against my knuckles as I stared out at the industrial park bathed in the last streaks of dusk. The low brick buildings of Harper Solutions stretched out like a defiance against the towering arrogance of Horizon, their silhouettes jagged against the fading gold of the sky. My chest was tight, a tangle of adrenaline and dread, the echo of Ellen's words, dismantle him, ringing in my skull. I'd said yes, stepped into their war, but the ground beneath me still felt like it could crack open any second, swallowing me whole. Megan's voice broke the stillness, sharp and urgent. Jake, we're not waiting. The team's assembling in the conference room, 5 minutes. You ready? I turned, meeting her gaze. Her dark eyes were steady, unrelenting, but there was a flicker of something softer beneath. Trust, maybe, or a dare. My throat tightened, the weight of 10 years at Horizon pressing down again, the faces of Tommy and Carl flashing through my mind. I'd walked out of Grayson's office a casualty, but here I was something else, a weapon, a key. The shift was dizzying, and beneath it, the anger still simmered, a low burn that hadn't faded since that pink slip hit my hands. Yeah, I said, my voice rough but firm. Let's do it. She nodded, a quick jerk of her chin, and strode out, her heels clicking down the hall. I followed, the toolbox banging against my thigh, with every step, a rhythm that matched the thud of my pulse. The hallway was narrow, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the scuffed linoleum, and the murmur of voices grew louder as we approached the conference room. My gut twisted, part nerves, part hunger. This was it, the moment the fight turned real, the point of no return. The door swung open, and the room hit me like a wave. It was cramped, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and whiteboard markers, the walls lined with charts and blueprints pinned up crookedly. A long table dominated the space, its surface cluttered with laptops, files, and half-empty mugs, and around it sat a handful of people, Harper Solutions crew, I guessed. Engineers in rumpled button-downs, an analyst with a tablet flickering in her hands, a grizzled guy with a beard who looked like he'd just come off a rig. They glanced up as we entered, their faces a mix of curiosity and exhaustion, but no one spoke. The tension was palpable, a coiled spring waiting to snap. Ellen stood at the head of the table, her cardigan sleeves pushed up, a marker in one hand and a legal pad in the other. She didn't waste time. All right, listen up. This isn't a debrief, it's a war room. Grayson's got Apex medals. and he's gunning for our next bid. We've got Jake Bennett here, 10 years at Horizon, knows their operation inside out. He's our edge. Let's use it. Her words landed like a gavel, and the room shifted. Eyes on me now, sharp and expectant. I set the toolbox down by the door, the clang cutting through the hum of a space, and stepped forward. My hands flexed at my sides, the instinct to retreat warring with the fire Ellen had lit. I wasn't a suit, wasn't a strategist, just a guy who'd hauled steel and dodged Grayson's ego for a decade. But they were looking at me like I held the map to bury him, and damn if that didn't stir something deep. A hunger I hadn't felt since that rooftop with Ellen all those years ago. Start with the basics, Megan said, sliding into a chair and pulling a laptop closer. Horizon's weak spots, what can we hit? I exhaled, the air scraping my throat, and leaned my palms on the table, the wood cool under my skin. The room narrowed to this, the faces around me, the hum of the laptops, the weight of Grayson's shadow looming beyond these walls. Okay, I said, my voice steadying as I spoke. Horizon's a machine, but it's sloppy. Grayson's obsessed with quotas, pushes the lines past capacity. Equipment's old, maintenance logs are a joke. I've seen forklifts break down mid-shift, welders spark out, because no one's greased them in months. He cuts corners to hit numbers, but it's a house of cards, one bad inspection, and it's over. The bearded guy, Rig, someone called him, grunted, scribbling on a notepad. OSHA violations. Plenty, I said, the memory of late nights patching leaks flashing through me. Foreman fudges the reports, but the logs don't lie if you dig. Grayson doesn't care, thinks he's untouchable. Ellen's marker scratched across the whiteboard, the word compliance slashing bold and red. Good. We've got contacts at the state level, discreet, but they'll move if we hand them proof. What else? My mind raced, pulling up a decade's worth of grit and grime. Supply chain's a mess. Grayson's locked into a single steel vendor, overpriced, late half the time. Crew bitches about it constantly, but he won't switch, probably a kickback deal. You undercut that, you choke his production. Megan's fingers flew across her keyboard, her jaw tight. Apex Metals is their biggest client now. If we poach their supplier, Grayson's screwed. Exactly, I said, the pieces clicking into place, sharp and electric. And the crew, guys like Tommy and Carl, they're stretched thin. Grayson's jacked quotas so high they're burning out. One spark, a strike, a walkout, and his efficiency bullshit collapses. The analyst, a wiry woman with glasses slipping down her nose, looked up from her tablet. Union whispers. Not yet, I said, my chest tightening at the thought. But they're close. I've heard it in the break room, grumbling, threats. Grayson doesn't see it. Thinks he can squeeze harder, and they'll just take it. Ellen capped her marker, turning to face me fully, her eyes glinting with something fierce. That's our opening. We don't just hit his contracts, we turn his own people against him. Jake, you've got names, faces. Can you reach them? The question slammed into me, a jolt that straightened my spine. Reach them. Tommy's quick grin, Carl's steady hands, the guys who'd clapped me on the shoulder, who'd trusted me to lead. My stomach churned, the moral tangle tightening like a noose. They're my family, I said, my voice low, raw. 10 years, Ellen. I can't just... You're not betraying them, she cut in, her tone hard but not cruel. Grayson is. You said it yourself, he's breaking them. You reach out, you give them a way to fight back. Not for us, for them. Her logic was a blade, slicing through the guilt, but it didn't dull the ache. I saw Tommy's face again, heard his voice. Asterisk, you stare down the devil. Man asterisk, and felt the weight of what she was asking. Not just intel, not just cracks in Horizon's armor. This was personal, a line I couldn't uncross. My hands curled into fists, nails biting into my palms, and the room went quiet, every eye on me waiting. I don't know, I said finally, the words scraping out. They'd listen maybe, but if Grayson catches wind, they're gone too. Pink slips all around. I'd be putting them on the line, not just me. Megan leaned forward, her voice softer now, but no less firm. You're already on the line, Jake. We all are. Grayson's not stopping. He'll crush Horizon's crew, and us with it. You've got a chance to tip the scales. For them, for you. Her words echoed Ellen's, a 1-2 punch that hit harder than Grayson's smirk. I straightened, the table creaking under my weight, and felt the shift inside me, a crack widening, letting the anger flood back in, hotter now, laced with something sharper. Revenge wasn't just a spark anymore, it was a fire, and I could feel it burning through the doubt. But the cost, the faces of the guys I'd stood with for a decade, hung heavy, a shadow I couldn't shake. Before I could answer, the door banged open, and a kid, barely 20, all nervous energy and a mop of brown hair, stumbled in, a phone clutched in his hand. "Ellen, Megan, sorry, but you need to see this. Now." He thrust the phone at Ellen, and she took it, her face tightening as she read the screen. Megan leaned over, her breath catching, and the room went still, the air thickening with a tension I could taste. Ellen looked up, her eyes locking onto mine, and I knew, whatever it was bad. "Grayson's moving," she said, her voice low, lethal. "Just hit our next bid. Undercut us by 15%. And he's got a press release out. Horizon Industries welcomes new talent, cuts dead weight." "You're the dead weight, Jake. He's spinning your firing into a win." The words slammed into me, a sucker punch that stole the air from my lungs. Dead weight. My decade of sweat, my name on a line, twisted into a headline for his ego. The rage flared white hot, drowning out the guilt, the doubt, everything but the image of Grayson's smirk as he sat in his polished office, sipping victory while I stood here, gutted. My hands trembled, the table edge biting into my palms, and I felt the room tilt, the stakes climbing higher, the war turning personal in a way I hadn't seen coming. Megan cursed under her breath, slamming her laptop shut. "He's fast, too fast." He knew we'd counter. "He doesn't know shit," I snapped, the heat spilling out before I could stop it. "He thinks I'm done, thinks you're scrambling. He doesn't know I'm here, doesn't know what I've got." Ellen's half-smile flickered, a glint of steel in her eyes. "Then let's use that. He's overplayed his hand, cocky, sloppy. Jake, you're the ghost in his machine now. Tell us where to hit him, and we hit hard." I nodded, the fire steadying me, grounding me. "Start with the vendor, steal his steel supply. He's crippled by next quarter. Leak the maintenance logs, anonymous, through your state contacts. And the crew." I paused, the ache flaring again, but I shoved it down. "I'll talk to Tommy. Quietly. If he's in, others will follow. Grayson won't see it till it's too late." The room erupted, rig barking orders, the analyst tapping furiously, Megan pulling files, but I stayed still, the weight of my choice settling like concrete in my chest. Tommy's trust, Carl's respect, I was gambling it all, turning my family into pawns in a fight they hadn't asked for. The moral tangle twisted tighter, justice and betrayal blurring into a gray haze, but the rage drowned it out. Grayson had made this personal, stripped me bare and danced on the ashes. He'd misjudged me, thought I'd break. I wouldn't. Not now. Ellen clapped a hand on my shoulder, her grip firm, steadying. "You're doing this for them, Jake. For you. He doesn't get to win." I met her gaze, the fire mirrored there, and nodded. The conference room buzzed around us, a storm building, but inside I felt the shift, anger turning to resolve, humiliation forging into something harder. This was the climax, the peak of the fight I'd been clawing toward since that rooftop. Grayson's tower was cracking, and I'd be the one to bring it down, one spark, one strike at a time. The rain drummed a steady rhythm against the roof of the Charlotte house, a soft, relentless patter that filled the quiet of the evening. I stood in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, the warm glow of the pendant lights casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. The space smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, and the roast Megan had pulled from the oven an hour ago, the remnants of dinner still lingering on the plates stacked in the sink. Beyond the window, the backyard stretched out in a blur of green and gray, the oak tree swaying under the weight of the storm. It wasn't Horizon's steel jungle or Harper Solutions' scrappy industrial park. This was home, a place I'd built from the ashes of a decade-long fight, and the weight of that truth settled over me like the rain itself, heavy, grounding, alive. Megan sat at the table across the room, her dark hair spilling loose over her shoulders, a notebook spread open in front of her. She tapped a pen against her lips, her brow furrowed as she scribbled something, then scratched it out. The soft scratch of graphite on paper blended with the storm outside, and I watched her for a moment, the curve of her jaw catching the light. 3 years since that night in Ellen's office. 3 years since we'd turned Grayson's empire into rubble, and here we were planning a future that felt impossibly real. A future with a crib in the next room, a tiny heartbeat growing inside her, a life I hadn't dared imagine back when I was just a kid with a toolbox and a chip on my shoulder. "You're staring," she said without looking up, her voice teasing but soft, cutting through the hum of my thoughts. I grinned, pushing off the counter and crossing the room to her. "Can't help it. You're plotting world domination over there, and I'm just trying to keep up." She laughed, a sound that still caught me off guard, light and unguarded, and set the pen down, tilting her head to meet my eyes. Not quite. Just figuring out daycare options. Apparently, Charlotte's got a wait list longer than Horizon's old supply chain. I slid into the chair beside her, the wood creaking under me, and glanced at the notebook. Her handwriting was sharp, precise, names of centers, costs, little stars next to the ones she liked. "We'll figure it out," I said, resting my hand over hers, the warmth of her skin steadying me. "Kid's got 2 parents who took down Grayson. Daycare's nothing." Her smile softened, and she turned her hand to lace her fingers through mine. "True, but I'd rather not leave it to the last minute. Ellen's already offering to babysit, Says she's ready to teach the next generation how to fight." I chuckled, picturing Ellen with a toddler on her hip, barking orders like she did in that conference room. She'd have him unionized by preschool. Grayson wouldn't stand chance. Megan's laugh faded into a comfortable silence, and I leaned back, the chair tipping slightly as I took in the room. The kitchen wasn't big, nothing like the sprawling offices Grayson had lorded over, but was ours. The fridge hummed softly, covered in magnets from trips we'd taken, a lighthouse from a coast, a skyline from Atlanta, a cheesy "I Heart Charlotte," one we'd grabbed on a whim. On the counter, a framed photo of the 3 of us, me, Megan, and Ellen, stood propped against a vase, taken the day Harper Solutions landed its first major contract post-Horizon. Ellen's arm was around my shoulder, her half-smile as fierce as ever, and I looked different. Older, sure, but lighter too, like the weight of a decade had finally lifted. The memory of that fight still lingered, sharp-edged and raw when I let it surface. Grayson's fall hadn't been quick. It was a slow bleed, a death by 1,000 cuts. The vendor switch crippled his production. The leaked logs triggered fines and inspections that gutted his margins. And Tommy, had been the spark I'd feared and needed. One quiet call, a beer at his place, and he'd listened, his jaw tight as I laid out Grayson's game. 2 weeks later, the crew walked out, a silent revolt that stopped Horizon cold. Grayson's press release about new talent turned to ash when the headlines shifted. Horizon Industries faces strike, safety violations. He was gone within a year, resigned, disgraced, a ghost of the titan he'd pretended to be. I'd won. We'd won. But the cost still gnawed at me sometimes, a quiet ache I couldn't shake. Tommy and Carl had landed on their feet. Harper Solutions scooped them up when the dust settled, but others hadn't. Faces I'd known for years, guys who'd trusted me, scattered when Horizon downsized, their lives upended by a war they hadn't signed up for. Justice had a price, and I'd paid it with pieces of the family I'd built. That guilt was a shadow, faint but persistent, even here in this warm kitchen with Megan's hand in mine. "You're doing it again," she said, pulling me back. Her eyes searched mine, steady and knowing, thinking about it. I exhaled, running a hand through my hair. "Yeah. Hard not to, sometimes. We got him, Meg. Grayson's gone, Horizon's a shell. But I still see their faces, guys who didn't make it through." She squeezed my hand, her grip firm, grounding. "You didn't ruin them, Jake. Grayson did. You gave them a shot, Tommy, Carl, the ones who fought back. You can't carry the ones who didn't." Her words were a balm, not a cure, but they softened the edge of the ache. I nodded, letting her logic settle in, and glanced at the notebook again. "You're right. Gotta focus on what's ahead, huh? This kid's not gonna care about my old battles." "Exactly," she said, her smile returning, bright and fierce. "They're gonna care about you teaching them how to swing a hammer or argue their way out of trouble. Ellen's already got the hammer part covered." I laughed, the sound loosening something tight in my chest, and leaned over to kiss her, quick, soft, a promise I hadn't known I could make 3 years ago. The rain picked up outside, a low roar against the windows, and I felt the shift inside me, not just resolve, but peace, fragile but real. The fight with Grayson had forged me, hammered me into something harder, sharper, but this here was what it had all been for. A life I'd earned, not just survived. The doorbell rang, a sharp chime cutting through the storm, and Megan raised an eyebrow. "Expecting someone?" "Nope," I said, standing and stretching, the ache in my shoulders a faint echo of the old days. "Probably Ellen, dropping off more baby books she swears we need." I crossed to the front door, the hardwood cool under my socks, and pulled it open. The porch light flickered, illuminating the rain-slick figure standing there, umbrella dripping onto the mat. My breath caught, a jolt of recognition hitting me like a punch. Mom. Her gray hair was tucked under a scarf, her coat soaked through, and her eyes, Those same eyes that had wept over my rejection of college all those years ago met mine with a hesitance I hadn't seen before. "Jake," she said, her voice soft, almost lost in the rain. "Can I come in?" I stepped back, the door creaking wider, and nodded, my throat too tight to speak. She shook out her umbrella, leaving it by the steps, and crossed the threshold, her shoes leaving faint wet prints on the floor. Megan appeared behind me, her hand brushing my arm, a silent question in her touch. I gave her a small nod. Asterisk, I've got this asterisk, and she retreated to the kitchen, leaving us alone in the narrow foyer. Mom stood there, clutching her purse like a shield, her gaze darting around the space, the coat rack, the framed photo of our wedding on the wall, before settling back on me. "I wasn't sure you'd let me in," she said finally, her voice trembling just enough to crack something inside me. "Why wouldn't I?" I asked, though I knew the answer. 10 years of silence, broken only by stilted calls and guilt-laced cards. Dad's anger and her prayers had built a wall between us, one I'd stopped trying to climb after Horizon swallowed me whole. But here she was, standing in my house, and the old defiance flickered, tempered now by something softer. "I heard about the baby," she said, her eyes dropping to her hands and back up. "From Ellen of all people. She called last week. Said you'd made something of yourself." I didn't believe her at first. The words stung, a quiet jab at the kid I'd been, stubborn, lost, betting on a factory job over their dreams. But there was no venom in her tone, just a weariness I recognized. I swallowed, stepping closer, the rain a dull roar behind us. "Yeah, well, Ellen's got a way of seeing things I didn't. Took me a while to catch up." She nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line, and then slowly she reached out, her hand trembling as it rested on my arm. "I'm proud of you, Jake. I should have said it sooner, years ago. Your dad, he never understood. But I see it now. This," she gestured vaguely at the house, the life beyond the foyer. "It's more than I ever thought." The lump in my throat thickened, and I covered her hand with mine, her skin cold and fragile under my calluses. "You don't have to say that, Mom. I made my choices. I know what they cost you." "No," she said, sharper now, her eyes glistening. "You cost me nothing. I cost myself, staying quiet, letting him drive you away. I'm here because I want to know you again. And my grandchild." Her words broke something open, a dam I'd held tight since that night on the rooftop. Not anger, not guilt, but a release, a quiet, aching peace I hadn't known I needed. I pulled her into a hug, her frame small against me, and felt the years slip away, not erased, but softened. "Okay," I murmured into her hair. "We'll start there." When I stepped back, Megan was watching from a kitchen doorway, her smile small but warm, and Mom wiped her eyes, a shaky laugh escaping her. "I brought cookies," she said, pulling a tin from her purse. "Figured I'd bribe my way in." "Smart move," I said, taking the tin, the weight of it grounding me further. "Come on, Meg's got coffee on. You can tell her all about your babysitting competition with Ellen." We moved to the kitchen, the rain a steady backdrop, and as Mom settled at the table, her coat draped over a chair, I felt the pieces click into place. Grayson was gone, Horizon a memory, the fight a scar that had healed into strength. I'd confronted my past, Dad's ghost in Mom's words, my own defiance in the life I'd built, and found something better on the other side. Not just revenge, not just justice, but a family. Megan, the baby on the way, Ellen's fire, and now Mom. Tentative, but here. Later, after Mom left and the house quieted, I stood by the window again, Megan's arms slipping around me from behind. "You okay?" she whispered, her breath warm against my neck. "Yeah," I said, turning to face her, the rain a faint echo now. "More than okay. We did it, Meg. All of it." She nodded, her eyes bright, and I kissed her again, slow this time, tasting the future in it. The storm outside faded, leaving only the hum of our home, the promise of tomorrow, and a joy I'd fought tooth and nail to claim. Grayson had lost. I'd won, not just the war, but this, a life worth living, a family worth keeping. And as I held her, the weight of the past finally lifted, replaced by a quiet, unshakable hope.